My question, I forgot to ask, are you all okay if I record it and I'll send you a consent form later and it'll go on our website?
Yes.
I see nods all around. Okay. Thank you, great. Sabrina. I totally forgot that. So
I'm going to open the room now.
Excellent. Hello and welcome. We're just a minute until the top of the hour when we'll get started. So glad to see folks joining us today to talk about democratic engagement and impacts. The speakers and I just had a nice, good chat session and learned a little bit about each other and our different programs, and they're already planning future takeovers of democratic education. So I think we'll have a great conversation in just a minute. I think we have an intimate group today, which is going to be fantastic. And I may turn it to you throughout the session to sort of ask questions, and I'll incorporate that into our conversation today. So I want to leave lots of time for our conversation. So I'm going to get started, and as latecomers join us, we'll welcome them in the chat and I'll say hello as we go. So my name is Jennifer Wolowick, and I'm one of the lead authors for the workbook we're going to incorporate into our dialogue today. And I'm one of the leaders of our Strengthening Canadian Democracy initiative here at the Simon Fraser University Morris J. Wosk Center for Dialogue. I'm joined by a fabulous group for what I hope will be an informal, geeky dinner table chat about evaluations. Matt said he needs more of those geeky conversations in his life, so we are going to deliver today. But first, I'd like us all to sort of check in on how we're feeling about evaluations today. What's our starting point? So we have a poll that gives you some options. Which one kind of fits how you're feeling today? And go ahead and click that and submit, and we'll let that sit out there for a couple minutes just to see, you know, it's a Wednesday, it's a hump day. Where's our starting point for our conversation as a group today? Give it a couple more seconds there. And then we'll find out. And speakers, you are required to answer this question as well. So, and they're going to share that why. All right, let's see how we're feeling. Let's go ahead and see those results, please. Pops up. They will save the world. We have some very optimistic thinkers here and some very exciting. We have a significant number who think they're overwhelming and that they're hard. And we've got a couple newcomers as well of, you know, I don't know enough. So this is the exact place to be if you don't know enough, or if you feel overwhelmed, or if you think they will save the world. And we will continue on with that today. Now, in Canada, we like to begin events in a good way. And thus it's important to start with a bit of a reflection and a land acknowledgement. And today, as I'm speaking from a suburb just outside of Vancouver, it's even more important than usual. Over the last 72 hours, BC here has experienced the destruction of our transportation system. Hundreds remain stranded. There's catastrophic flooding surrounding where I'm sitting. And railways and highways are probably going to be closed for months. And so in that context, I didn't feel it was enough today to simply say that this workbook was created on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Because the reason we start gatherings like in this way is not only to name the histories, but to name the present and to recognize whose knowledge has been shunned and whose experiences are often made invisible. So last night, just south of me, the lake of the Stolo people nearly turned back into a lake as a pump station was overwhelmed and nearly flooded a valley. So the Stolo and other nations had lived beside this lake for millennia. Then in the 1920s, the colonial governments drained it for agricultural land. And machines turned the lake into a prairie and has kept it that way for decades. I've driven through this area several times, never knew it was a lake. And then this weekend, that system failed. And literally right now, farmers are herding cows by jet skis. And I wanted to tell this story so that in our conversation today, we also think about whose ways of knowing, practices of governance, land management, and technology have been promoted in our local communities and how that creates very real physical and lived outcomes. And each of our organizations today, as you can see on this map, are located in different areas. And I'm certain they have similar histories and similar stories and similar outcomes. So before we talk today about evaluations and have a very geeky dinner conversation about them, I want to acknowledge that they are a very real form of knowledge production that tends to privilege very certain ways of thinking over others. and certain methodologies over others. And so before we go there, I want to ask you all to think about what is the history that surrounds where you are? What are the different ways of knowing that exist in your communities? And how does that shape your lived experience? Take a moment to reflect on that. I want to acknowledge that until last night, I had no idea a Stolo Lake existed. And so a question I'm asking myself today is, what don't I know? And how do I go find that information? And I want our conversation today, and I'm so excited to be joined by the folks who will go on this journey with me, to start in that space, grounded in some vulnerability, some honesty, and some curiosity. And so today we're in a dialogue with this workbook and what it's about. And dialogues happen best when you're joined with people who you respect and admire. So I am so excited to introduce to you all Valerie Lemming, Director of Exploratory Research at the Kettering Foundation. Wave, Valerie. Matt Leininger. See, I knew how to say it and then I still got it wrong. Performance pressure. Leininger, Head of Democracy Innovation at the National Conference on Citizenship. Erica de Torres, Director of Impact and Development for Apathy is Boring. And Gladys O'Keefe, founder of O'Keefe and Associates, a consulting and evaluation firm for nonprofits and the public sector organizations in Toronto. So as you mentioned, or as I made all of you answer the poll and I wanted them to answer it, I would love to pass the microphone over to each of them so that they can introduce themselves with where they're starting with evaluations today and how they answered the poll and why. So Valerie, why don't I start it with you? How did you answer the poll?
You know, everybody always starts the first conversation with the need to unmute. So first of all, thanks so much for the opportunity to join in the conversation from Dayton, Ohio. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be with old friends. Imperfections of evaluation tools, I think, is the broad category. And so for me, what I think about, first of all, is that evaluations are learning tools. And they should be one of the tools you use, but not the only tool. I happen to like the anecdotal experience of stories as they illuminate experiences in ways that are really important. And so I think about that as well. But let me move on to the specific question that you asked. And to me, an evaluation can be a window into understanding how the work you do is understood and practiced by others. Evaluations won't save the world, but they do inform how you can work more strategically, identify partnerships and collaborations that expand the depth and reach of your work, and ways your work can contribute to sustainable communities and promote democratic practices that are inclusive and foster the co-production of public work. And I'll talk about this notion of co-production later on in my comments. Evaluations are a learning tool. A learning with and from others can be fun and inspiring. To know that they're fellow travelers exploring similar terrain in search of true north. So there's something fun about them, in my opinion. There are different types of evaluations, and the workbook has a set of series, but they're formulative, process, economic, impact evaluations. And they're not hard, especially when you elicit support from your network and share the responsibilities of others, like Gladys. If I wanted to do an assessment and evaluation of the organization's finances, she'd be someone I'd call and say, look, can you come in and do an evaluation for me? So use people that you know in your network to help you. We can't all know everything about every topic. And so feel free to use the networks. Believe me, in our early call, I tapped into that network myself already. And if you've not tried it, how do you know if you're not doing the things that you think you should be. If you haven't done an evaluation, my suggestion is you don't know the difference that you can make in the world. So hopefully I have responded to the idea across the comments and the options, because I think all are just a little bit true for most of us. So thank you.
I like that idea of them all being a little bit true. And you sing to my heart when you mention stories. And I hate that people think that they're anecdotal. Like they're people's truths, and you can see patterns in them when you hear more than one story. So Gladys, you were mentioned in terms of evaluation. Why don't I pass it over to you? How are you feeling about evaluations today?
Sure, I feel good. I usually feel good about evaluations. However, I was part of the group that indicated that they can be overwhelming, and even in my world, even in my space, of helping others navigate their way through it. And the reason for that is I am one of those people that is forever curious about other people, and the things that they do, the way that they interact, the way that they move throughout the world. And evaluations can really help us better understand that. But there is so much to learn. And I find with each one, there are more and more things that my clients, my partners, my colleagues want to be able to pull out of that evaluation, retrieve from it. And it's not always possible to get everything at one go. And helping people manage their expectations of what can come out of it, and really concentrate on what is the big win here. What are we really, truly looking for? Can be an overwhelming process. You start very high, you got to bring people down, and you try not to deflate them in that process, right? And really, continue to reassure them that you will get something strong. There will be something really good, but we need to be really focused and targeted and intentional with what we're doing. So I feel good about them. I'm always encouraged by them, but they absolutely can be overwhelming if you don't manage your expectations and really be intentional about what you're taking on. Really looking forward to participating today. Thank you so much for the invitation, Jen, and feeling like I'm in great company with the other panelists here and the audience. So looking forward to the chat today.
Excellent. Yeah, you really bring in that we want evaluations to be perfect. We want to know everything. And really the process, which we hope we'll turn to talk about today, is like, how do you decide what's most important to you? And how do you then find the methods that align? So thanks for introducing that into our kind of themes today. Erica, why don't I pass it over to you? How are you about evaluations today? How did you answer the poll?
Yeah, for sure. So I answered the poll as they are exciting. Truthfully, when I was listening to both Valerie and Gladys, all of that resonated with me. But before that, thank you again for inviting us to be part of this panel. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that I am in Montreal, or so-called Montreal, located in Tiohtià:ke, and it is the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. And thank you so much, Jennifer, for bringing that and bringing the land acknowledgement to light, and also making us reflect on it. So that was really great. And yeah, going back to the question itself, I answered that they are exciting, but like I said, I think that they all truly hit home for all sections of it, being overwhelming, can't save the world, hard. And I chose all of this because they reflect the process for us as a youth-led, youth-run, for youth organization. So we're all learning. So a bunch of us, especially in the research team, are under 30. A lot of us hold different knowledges. A lot of us hold different experiences with evaluations. And sometimes they're extremely overwhelming, depending on the project that we are trying to measure and we're trying to evaluate. Sometimes they're extremely exciting. Given an example of our current vote evaluation process, where we modified a lot of our evaluations to be online and virtual. And sometimes they can be hard. And that hard aspect also hits the perfection aspect too, where I want to get as much information as possible, but what are the constraints? What do the funders want from me? What type of capacity do we have? Do we have everything that we need? So all of these things really, really do resonate with me. And in terms of saving the world, I don't know about the world entirely, but I do know that it does improve our programs and it does improve our services for the young people that we serve. So for me, as a young person that was served by apathy is boring, it's extremely important. And I'm always so excited to hear feedback from our participants, because that's how we can make it better for people like me, but also for other young people all around Canada engaging with Canadian democracy.
Excellent. Thank you, Erica. I didn't know that you were a apathy is boring participant that has now become part of the organization. So it's great to hear your own capacity building, and now that you're leading their evaluations. And I know you and I had a conversation before this talking really about, how do you bring that learning into the team, which we're also going to kind of touch upon today. So last but not least, Matt, how did you answer?
Oh, I answered exciting, but let me get to that in a second. So first, let me say thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Matt Leininger. I live in Hamilton, Ontario, proud Canadian. And as you also may know, I'm the area that Hamilton is part of. This part of Ontario is part of the home of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is, as you probably know, the source of some of the world's first great democratic governance systems and documents influencing the U.S. Constitution, lots of other things. So this is a kind of a great kind of place for democracy at its beginnings. I actually, though I was not born here, I'm from the U.S. originally. I'm a proud American as well. And since my career had started before I came to Canada, I have maintained essentially an American career. Mostly as a practitioner. I now work at the National Conference on Citizenship, which is based in Washington, D.C. Before that, I worked at Everyday Democracy, then the Deliberative Democracy Consortium, and then Public Agenda. And so as a practitioner of those different organizations, that's how I got to this question of evaluation and measurement. I was trying to do interesting things and work with people to do interesting things, and we wanted to figure out whether they were working and whether people liked them. And it has been a very difficult challenge, as I know a lot of you have experienced. It's very difficult because democratic work has a lot of different unpredictable benefits. You often go into something thinking, oh, yes, we're going to have this outcome, and you don't, but you have this other outcome that you didn't anticipate. So there's that kind of because it has different potential outcomes on the individual level, the local or neighborhood level, the city level, or whatever, it has these different levels of outcomes, different types of things that can happen, and it's hard to anticipate what those are going to be. It's also inherently difficult because, well, first of all, another thing is a lot of that is difficult to measure and certainly difficult to quantify. Not always impossible, but difficult to quantify. And then also, because it's democratic, it's not just what you, the practitioner or the public official or the evaluator is interested in, it's the outcomes that the people you are engaging might be interested in. They may be different, or somewhat different from what you came into this with. So there's kind of an inherent unpredictability, which is good. It's democratic, but it makes it difficult for evaluation and measurement because the things that you came into the process or a project or a structure looking for are not necessarily the same things exactly that the other people you're inviting into that space brought with them. So that's part of what is also exciting about this, because I think as we kind of are able to kind of crack this nut, I think that a couple of things that we're beginning to do that are very exciting. One is anytime you evaluate something, you have to define it. And especially if you're working with people up front, the people you're trying to engage, to define what you're doing and what you think the outcomes are going to be, the evaluation forces you to do that. It's a very important conversation and very exciting. And then the other thing is that any kind of evaluation, especially thinking about our civic health, our democracy, our engagement, anything you evaluate, that carries with it the idea that it can be improved. And part of our problem today in the US and Canada, all over the place, is this enormous level of resignation about democracy and politics. We're all frustrated and mistrustful and annoyed and fearful about all of this stuff. Yet most people kind of think of it as something they can't do something about. It's static. It's a static system. And so to evaluate something implies, okay, well, maybe we can make it better somehow. And that's a tremendously big and important conceptual leap, that you can help people make by kind of introducing the idea that, hey, we can measure this stuff and we can evaluate.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think that's an idea that there's some optimism into evaluations, because there is a sense of like, okay, they often almost take a strength-based approach of what is working and how do we keep that going, or how do we improve that in these cycles. So I will admit, for me, I said overwhelmed. And that's partly because I'm trained as an anthropologist, not as an evaluator, and definitely not as a quantitative person. And so Matt, when I was sitting on a panel last week at the National Conference on Citizenship, I kept hearing words like regression, disaggregate, deviation, thematic coding. And I'm like, wow, this is a whole different language. And that was one of the things we wanted to tackle in this workbook or in this offering, was to take that, to understand that language, or to pull it into something that's a bit more accessible. And then it comes also from a motivation of, we kept hearing from government and funders the constant question of like, okay, so we know improving democracy is important, but how do we know what's going to work? What evidence do you have? And I mentioned earlier today about, you know, this idea of privileging knowledge. And so governments, when they're asking you for evidence, they're often asking you for particular kinds of information, privileging a certain way. And so how do you deliver that to help create change? And so that's part of where evaluations can help. Those are some of the tools, but as Gladys had said, there's other ways as well, and we should think of combining things together. We also know, as Matt alluded to, that basically everything we do can either strengthen or weaken democracy, from our local communities to our education programs to a drop-in teen center. So how could you incorporate that into some of the questions you might ask, or those ideas into questions you might ask in other evaluations? How do you incorporate some democratic engagement ideas? Just so that you have that as part of the information you're gathering. Because as Matt said, sometimes you get different and new information in these processes. So that's really what motivated the workbook itself. And we wanted to help folks get over the fear of evaluation. And as I was reviewing different evaluation workbooks that are out there, they often ask the reader really good formative questions, some of which we're going to cover in a couple minutes, but then they stop. They don't actually lead you through options or lead you through a question packet that you could then customize to what you need. And so we really want to provide something that you can download. You don't need to be taught step by step, because you have a resource at your hands that will literally take you into what do you want to know. It begins with asking a set of questions so that you can help identify what your evaluation personality is. Are you someone who's new? Are you someone who's doing a huge program or a small one? Are you someone who's got a lot of resources and experience on your team or not? And then it will help you do some recommendations on methods you might want to consider. All of that is to say that this really is meant to be a step-by-step starting point. As I mentioned, and as our speaker sort of mentioned, there's other ways of knowing and other ways of capturing that knowledge that doesn't exist in these pages. But the hope is that you could start to flip through this and think about those things and customize it to what you need. We don't encourage you to use every single question. We don't encourage you to read every single page of this 80+ page booklet. It's designed as a choose your own evaluation adventure. And you'll see in the workbook that it actually tells you to skip a section if you're not interested. That's okay. It's about customizing it for yourself. It's about, as Gladys said, narrowing down what's most important for you and then acting on it and gathering that data and then using it for what you need. And so instead of a presentation to me where I'm going to walk through each chapter, our conversation is going to be a bit about in that theme of choosing our own adventure, where to start, some things to consider from our speaker's experience. And we're going to end really talking about people, because evaluations are really about people. And as Matt alluded to, democracy is very complex and very hard to measure. It's a big thing. So we asked ourselves, where do you start? We want to offer a place to start, which is about breaking it down into smaller bits. And so part of it is we've incorporated a suggestion of some principles that are easier to measure than the big complex thought of democratic engagement. So we offer 5 principles. One is the capacity to participate. Are you someone who's trying to build skills, such as apathy is born? Are you fostering commitment to democratic values? That idea of equity or equality in your programming. Are you deepening relationships and social connections? Part of that storytelling that Gladys was talking about. Are you practicing equity and care, putting people first as you bring them together in whatever you're doing? And can you ask questions that can help your participants tell you how you're doing? And then as well as accountability. So are you being accountable to your own participants? Are you being accountable to your funders? And how do people rank how you're doing? And so as we pull down this slide today, where you can find our workbook and bring up all of our faces for our lovely dinner chat conversation, I'm going to pass it over to Erica, because Apathy is Boring has been running programming for youth to get them engaged, and they have been doing evaluations of them. And so for you, Erica, when you think about or reflect on the evaluations that you've done, which one of these principles is sort of a good starting point that you might include in the future, or you already have?
Yeah, for sure. So I read this this workbook, and admittedly, I loved it because it provided an accessible place for people to start, especially folks, and this is kind of a side note for answering the question, we want to incorporate youth-led evaluations process as part of our evaluations process. So this is really exciting because now we have a workbook to actually point them to be like, hey, this is a really cool starting point. And in terms of the 5 principles for democratic engagement, I actually thoroughly believe that we go through all 5 of these points. So as you mentioned, we are building the capacity to participate through skills building and measuring the types of skills that people are learning through pre and post surveys. We're also fostering a commitment to democratic values. We're deepening relationships and social connections, whether that's through mentors, through intergenerational connections, and all of that really fun networking opportunities and relationship building between participants, between the communities that they work in, and between the staff members. We also foster equity and caring throughout in all of our programs, especially in our RISE program, which I'll talk and touch on in a little bit. And finally, as part of our evaluations process, we do establish accountability. So whether that's through actually telling people through emails when we're asking them for surveys, oh, this is what we're using this for, or when we're actually hosting our focus groups, oh, this is what type of report's going to be coming out of this, and this is where you can expect to see in terms of next steps. So I truly believe that Apathy is Boring through our rigorous evaluations and through our rigorous evaluations process encompasses all 5 of these principles. And I think a really good place to kind of explore this further and see it in action is actually a report that we made just in 2020 called Together We Rise, where we talk about youth-led democratic innovation, and where we show all of these things and all of these principles within that report through the types of processes that we've done. So through our pre-post surveys, through interviews, and through rigorous research, to really uplift the types of findings that we're finding, whether that's through storytelling, whether that's through quantitative data. But yeah, so that is where we're at for those 5 principles in Apathy is Boring.
Awesome. I love that both in my poll to all of you, and then in this question, I've tried to force you to pick one thing, and all of you keep pushing back. And so here's the example of, your participants will never, ever do what you expect in an evaluation, but they'll tell you what is really, really important. And that's your moment to then stop and say, okay, what am I missing? So instead of asking others to pick a principle, I wonder if there is a principle that you might have noticed was missing, or something else that has come up in your work that you might emphasize as a starting place. Are these like the beginning and the end all 5 ideas of democratic engagement?
Jen, are you looking to us to respond?
I am looking for you to respond. Maybe that was right. Okay. Not a rhetorical question. I was trying to ask, what do you think is missing?
Well, I will share some thoughts. In addition to the 5 principles you've captured, I would suggest the following for consideration. 1, ways to support creating civic spaces for learning. Attention needs to be given to how people learn to work together. That's not something that's innate. That's not something we've had much opportunity to practice. Learn where to go to check facts. Learn more about a given topic. And I can give you an example of a project that might help then make it clearer what I'm talking about. In Cincinnati, there were policing issues between communities of color and the department. And People were intimidated by going into the police department to ask questions. They weren't always sure about the practices and policies of the officers on the street, and they really had no place to go to find out that information. So the community and the city got together and created what they called a neighborhood partnering center to help people interpret police reports, CompStat numbers, policing in general, to know if there had been a violation of a practice so that they could file a complaint, and then give the complaint to a place where they weren't going to be judged or feel as though they were being somehow discriminated against because they brought a complaint. And so creating that space for people to learn information upon which they could act is really important. To the extent that you're able to do that and capture that and evaluate the benefits of that, particularly for those of you who have outside funding opportunities, that, that's really a good place to be able to say, we did something that helped people learn how to work together and solve problems. The Kettering Foundations, as another example, research is about how to make citizen-centered democracy work as it should. And our findings show that when the public shares responsibility for naming, framing, deliberating, acting together to address a shared problem with public institutions, democracy works as it should. So I recommend capturing and evaluating the work citizens do with government, not so much the delivery of a service, but what happens when people work together. What was the work done? What was done? Why was it done? By whom? And what did people learn? I mean, capturing not just the service provided, but what did people learn from? How did they benefit from the work that was done, the service that was provided, the experience that they were able to share? And then lastly, in looking at this shared work or co-production, I suggest it would be helpful to provide a mechanism for public feedback. How do people in the public evaluate what you are doing? You can, I think, really benefit from those that you have an engagement with as advice and guidance on ways that you can do better and ways that you are really excelling and ways that people just aren't sure what you're doing. Again, could be useful feedback for you. So that, Jen, is what I have to share.
Oh, it's excellent. There is a filmmaker who's an anthropologist, and his name is Jean Rouch, and he has a quote that has stuck with me in all the different realms that I have worked in, and it is, you change the answer simply by asking the question. And so what is it you're looking to change? And then what is the question that you want to ask is such a really good starting point, because just by asking that question, just by asking what are democratic values that are important to you, you're sparking people to think about that. And they're going to start to think that through and ask that question. So it's one of those quotes that has guided me for a very long time, and not because it's meant to, scare you away from objectivity or observation, but to sort of lean into it and say, if by asking a question you change the answer, well, then it's exciting and what that question should be. And those things. I feel like I've sparked something for Matt. He's done the faraway gaze. So I'm gonna jump in here.
Sorry. Well, let me tack onto that, and also what you said, Valerie, by saying, I think, and maybe I'm not sure this is a separate principle or not, but giving people the opportunity to take that learning outside the kind of the boundaries of the project or the effort or the activity that you started in. I mean, most evaluation is, you're doing something with people and you're trying to learn from it. And maybe you structured it in a way that you all learn with them together about how it's working and what the outcomes are and so on and so forth. But if you can give them the opportunity to take that inquiry outside to some other meeting, some other activity, some other public institutions or whatever, else. And by taking that, it could be the question, as you said. It could also be a tool that they can use. Survey, it could be kind of, you could be equipping them with some of the kind of the tools and machinery they need to actually kind of, not just improve the activity that you have started with them, but actually improve other aspects of life, of democracy in their community. That's obviously a good thing. In my view.
and that's where some of these principles are kind of helpful framings. Like if you can only ask so many questions, okay, which one do I really want to matter? And dive into that, because democratic values don't just exist in a single program or in a single learning space, as Valerie said, but it exists everywhere. So you're like, oh, this is how this was really strengthened here. Could I do a similar thing somewhere else? And so, helping folks narrow down what that is that you want to find out, and creating that space where then the answers get changed or you discover something new that's really valuable. I'm gonna tell a story in a bit, but I'm gonna hold it off. That kind of illustrates what worked for us in terms of one of these types of evaluations that now guides a lot of our thinking in that. But first, I want to pass it to Gladys and sort of think about methods. So we talked about, where to start, how to do this. Valerie, you've really leaned us into, there's a learning journey and you should ask all about it. It's not just what happened before and what happened after, but allowing people to express in their own words their learnings and how to apply it elsewhere. And so that to me sort of leans into what we call a qualitative analysis, the storytelling. But one of the ways which you can think about qualitative versus quantitative is that qualitative starts to answer the why question. Why did this work? Was it the fact the person at the front door was smiling at me that made me feel welcomed? It's hard to write a survey question to really get at that, but surveys are really good for knowing what is going on. How many people showed up? On average, were they okay? Or were they really scared of the space? And so Gladys, as you're working with clients, how do you present that sort of understanding and working through with them? You talked about how in your intro, that working with clients who think evaluations, I want to know everything and I want it to be perfect and I want to use every method. How do you help people choose their own adventure and start to pick and choose?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I was struck by something that the example that Valerie had shared about the community and the policing, and it made, kind of dovetailing into this question, it makes me think about what is it that people are willing to hear through evaluation. And so when they, I don't often actually get into a conversation about choosing between the two methods. We really focus on what is it that you are actually trying to learn. And then on the back end, think about the methods that we could apply to help inform that information. But there is sometimes an element of fear sometimes, because particularly when it's shining a light on a process, an offering, especially if it's something that is new, or if it's an evaluation that you are not participating in willingly, it's been imposed on you, versus something that you're introducing. And so the methodologies that you apply tend to, need to really kind of create some balance that makes a safe experience, that still identifies critical pieces of information, that allows it to be provided in a safe and consistent way so that there's integrity to the process and that there's strength behind the actual final product that is delivered. So there's trade-offs to both. And I often don't actually get into a conversation about choosing between the two. I find that once we actually go through the process of what are you actually trying to learn and determine and to pull out, it leads us to either often to a combination of the two, or very, very heavy weighting on one or the other. The other thing that tends to play into preconceived notions of which method is better to proceed with is budget. There's often an assumption that qualitative will be more costly because you need to speak to people, and how long is that going to take to roll up everything people say and interpret all the variety of responses. Why not just go with a quantitative method and push everyone into a survey with options that they all need to choose from? It's not true. It's not been my experience that qualitative is more expensive in every single case. That there are ways to kind of maneuver and navigate your way through that, depending again on what you're working with and what it is essentially that you're trying to learn. So that's often my starting place. But when Valerie had shared her example, it made me think about the notion of accountability and responsibility in the space of conducting evaluations. And in the case of policing, especially in my work with young people, there's a lot of work that happens, to evaluate and assess what do citizen and police interactions look like, how should they be improved, what have we learned over the time of a particular incident that has sparked the need to take a deeper dive or closer look at this kind of thing. And I find that it's often those that are impacted greatly by something that's occurred that undertake this exercise or call for an evaluation to take place versus those that are perceived as the perpetrator or assumed to be the perpetrator. And you're doing a lot more thinking about the accountability that you have to citizens or to the public or to community to undertake those exercises yourself. I wonder how often, police officers or other entities think about how they're perceived. Whether their intentions are good or not is not actually the question, but how does community experience you? And how does that experience make it difficult for you to actually do your job, do the work, do it in partnership with others? So we tend to go down the line of questioning in order to determine what is the appropriate methodology to move through the process.
Yeah, you make a lot of good points there. Does anyone want to add on? No.
I see good questions in the chat there as well. So I think we're all doing a bit of double duty.
Yeah, we're listening
to the conversation.
So I'm going to, at this point, and so the audience knows, I had built a really structured run of show, and we were gonna, this was our method section, then we're gonna talk about outcomes, and then we're gonna talk about people. But what I think we need to do is talk about people right now, because that is what evaluations are about. And Gladys, as you said, even the people who call for an evaluation could be different, and why they're doing it is different. And so one of the things that's also very important to me, and it's in the evaluations that talk about ethics and the option to opt in or opt out of an evaluation. I struggle when joining a program or joining a service, it's required that you also participate in an evaluation in that. So maybe I can hear from all of you and your experiences, and Valerie and Eric, I'm looking at you, like, how do you introduce when you're thinking about a space, we're talking about that space of learning, or you're talking about your vote programming, Erica, like, how do you introduce the idea of an evaluation to the folks in that space who you want to hear from?
Yeah, so I can jump in because this is a great question, and something that we as a research team and Apathy is Boring is constantly thinking about, is because evaluations is such a huge part of our programming, because we need it for, like Mark already mentioned, funding requirements. We need it to better our own programs. We need it to serve our youth even better. So this accountability, this transparency is something that we're constantly thinking about and making it better, because as you can probably imagine, not a lot of people will opt in to take a survey. You send them an email, you let them know, for us at least, you let them know, oh, this survey is to make our programs better. We're hoping to improve the vote program, for example, so that right now, because we're in this transition of COVID, how did the pandemic affect the program that we're trying to do? So in terms of that one aspect of letting people know, we make sure that we're very upfront about it. Then when we start hosting the qualitative component of interviews and of focus groups, for example, when we do the call for people, actually also for surveys, we do incentivize, and this connects to another question that you had later on, Jen, which anyway, so we do try to incentivize, because it is a long process. One of our surveys for RISE is 90 questions long, which is so long, especially when you're trying to give these surveys to young people who have jobs, young people who also go to school, and who's, like, the RISE program is just one aspect of their lives at that given moment. So it's really important to value the fact that, yes, they're spending time to take that survey for you. And so it's important for us to be, like, for our team at least, to be completely aware about the time and dedication that they're putting into it. So typically we do incentivize to encourage them there, and in terms of just transparency and accountability as well. And all throughout it, especially when it comes to the actual focus groups and interviews themselves, we let them know what the intentions are. We let them know what the parameters are for these focus groups, and where exactly these findings will go and where these learnings will go. Because that's a really important part of that discussion as well, is for them to ask questions. And a lot of them do have questions about, hey, where does, like, you're doing this focus group with me, but where does it go next? And we're super happy to answer that, because we do know where it's going next, and we try to make it as accountable as possible. And then finally, for the programs themselves, we actually carve out a bit of time for the beginning of our program, where our research and evaluations lead, Melina, will go into the programs and into the different hub cities and say, hey, we understand that this is a 90 question survey, but this is why they're important to us. And this is what we'll do with all of the findings that we have afterwards. So it keeps it really transparent. And it also gives them the opportunity to ask us questions, because we want it to be as ethical as possible. And we want it to be a conversation. And we want to make sure that it's not extractive, even though a lot of the times it could be extractive. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
No, it does. I think it really leans to a theme, and it's one of the reasons I had a role as an ethics coordinator for a university for a time. And so what I tell people is that ethics is, that requirement forces you to think about your project from the perspective of the person who is giving you their knowledge. What is their experience from the very first time you say hello to the very end and after your report is published? You know, I had a wonderful experience in one of my first projects of sharing a report with a group of First Nations teenagers. And I had written a report and I said, at-risk youth. And this teenager's reading it and he's like, am I at risk? What does it mean? Like, I don't know if I'd identify as that. And it was a way in which it created a conversation about what were his supports and what were his strengths that he would see indifferently. But it was that experience that was a valuable one of being like, everything is about them and they are producing knowledge and they are doing work in that process. So how do you best center them? And then how do you best be accountable to them to create that learning experience? And Bessie has asked a great question around how do you engage those folks when the word democracy sort of turns them off? We at the center, we've named ourselves the Strengthening Canadian Democracy Initiative, and we go back and forth about whether or not we should use that word all the time, because people are like, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about climate change. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about inclusivity. I want to talk about anti-racism. I want to talk about this. And we've made an intentional choice to say, no, we're going to lead with democracy, because that's about how we see a system working as an aspirational system and its spaces. And so I think it's Bessie's question of how do you engage with that? It's about I think we're all talking here about relationship building and explaining to the person why democracy is the word you want to use. And for us, it's like, we don't want to become afraid of that word. That rubs us the wrong way, to be afraid of a word democracy rather than to use it, unpack it, improve it, and name its flaws that we see. And
that's also comment on that. And I noticed that Matt asked her if she was talking about Democratic Party as maybe the point of contention. But I think the words we use are important. And if we're not clear about what words mean, then there can be disagreement and misunderstanding. But that doesn't mean you don't use the word that is intentional for you. So in the work of the Kettering Foundation, we intentionally use the word citizen. And for us, it's not a legal status. It is the responsibility one has living in a democracy to own what happens. And there's no other word that speaks to ownership and responsibility than citizen, not resident, not neighbor, not person, not public, because it's an individual responsibility. The other thing that certainly I have learned over the course of my career and the research that we do at the foundation is that disagreeing with people is okay. If you don't hear what people have to say, because we're not all in agreement. Who always agrees with their child or their spouse? We don't always agree with others. It's the way we express our disagreement or our different opinion. And I suggest that finding common ground is not about ignoring the differences, but it really is about acknowledging that there are areas of tension, there are points of disagreement, there are points of conflict, and talking and trying to work through those differences based on the shared values that you have. You care about your community, you care about your child's education, you care about your own and your family's safety, whatever the particular topic might be, finding the undergirding values that you share and where you are willing to find that common ground. I may not like X, but I'm willing to do it because my neighbors support it. And so let me give you an example that I like to use to help illustrate my point. I may be against taxes in the US. Many people are anti-tax. And our local education systems are based on a citizen approved tax, usually on their property. And so for most seniors, as their kids have grown and moved away from home, they don't want to pay property taxes anymore to pay for the upcoming generation's education. And so there's always a big fight. So I may be an anti-taxer. I don't want to pay more in taxes. My kids are grown. I don't need it. I don't want my property values to go up, my taxes then to grow up. But I am in a conversation with my neighbors and discover that the next door neighbor that I love, without an increase in funding for schools, her child won't be able to have a bus to school. And she has to be at work at 7, and the child doesn't have to be at school till 8. And there's no childcare available that time of day, and she doesn't have a car. Well, I may be against taxation, but I love my neighbor and I understand and empathize with her situation such that in this instance, the common ground is I'm willing to support a tax increase because of the benefits to my neighbor, to my neighborhood, and ultimately to the children that might stay in this community because they're educated for the jobs that are here. And so finding common ground really does mean working through tension. So you shouldn't be afraid of that. Be clear on the ground rules, that people will be respectful and listen, just as the ground rules, Jen, that you put in the chat box for us in our conversation today.
Yeah, and it brings to mind that, the notion of citizenship, and I love that Kettering definition. As someone who's a permanent resident in Canada leading a democracy initiative and I can't vote, I don't see myself as outside the system at all. But it's been great. But I want to bring us into a conversation then around how we bring evaluations into that role of being a citizen, being a participant in that learning cycle. And Matt, I'm going to pass it to you because you've been one of the voices on what's called Participedia, of which the workbook does send people at the very end as go share what you've learned. And so can you talk about why it's so important that we start to sort of cross-fertilize these ideas? This is also very much the work of the Kettering Foundation and Apathy is Boring. And Gladys, I know from personal experience how much your own evaluations of different programs, the program we did at the center really changed our thinking. So how do we help our teams think about and be okay that that each outcome is going to shape ourselves? Or Matt, you can take this where you want to go. How do we start to really share that across groups as well?
Yeah, there's about 4 different threads here.
There was like 16 different questions there. Yeah, exactly. So, no biggie.
Participedia, just to give the grounding there, Participedia is this great resource. It's the Wikipedia of this work of democracy, engagement, all that sort of thing. It's been based at UBC for the last 5 years. It has just moved to a new home at McMaster in Hamilton, but it is in fact that is just the hub of this worldwide community of researchers of various kinds who are compiling examples of democratic engagement in various countries and organizations and methods and all kinds of things. And part of the idea from the beginning was to do that in a way that you're crowdsourcing all this information in a way that allows for comparison. So there's some similar questions that when you're doing a case, you're supposed to try to answer, and so that it's an enormous task, of course, but and there are all these different contexts and issues and places and all this sort of thing. But it makes it a very, very interesting and complicated resource. So that's one interesting, and I think part of behind the creation of that of Participedia is this notion, as you were saying, Jen, that we need all kinds of tools. We need all kinds of methods, and approaches to try to kind of understand this work and to evaluate it. And it helps if some of those things have some common DNA. That will allow innovation, in terms of structure and methods and all sorts of things, but it will also allow us to understand each other better. And so some of the common DNA, if I can relate this to one of the other threads, is what the heck do we mean by democracy and citizenship and things like that? And it is very complicated. It is, as Bessie pointed out, politically freighted, often confusing, often, people are not compelled by some of these terms we use. That's another problem, is that, they might know what they think engagement is, but that doesn't mean they want to do it, or participation or involvement or any one of these other civic synonyms. So So part of the challenge for us all is, as you said, I mean, we have to define what we mean and why it's important. That's a continuing thing we need to be doing more and more. Right now, it's incredibly frustrating in the US because so many people, when they hear or use the term democracy, all they mean is voting. That's it. They don't mean any of these other things that we all know to be core to a democratic experience and civic life. So yes, defining and clarifying what we mean. Also, though, using other media besides words. You know, I mean, and I've probably written as many words about democracy and engagement as anybody, so I'm guilty. But the words can only take you so far. We need images, we need video, we need infographics, we need cartoons, we need other ways of communicating the power of this stuff and why it's important. And so that's another kind of element of this that's important. But one more thing, just to have one more, I mean, Erica, what you said about, you know, part of what you're doing in the process is to kind of understand people's motivations, you know, for why, you know, explain to them why it's going to be helpful, why they should be part of these evaluations. And that type of approach is significant and helpful and unique, and it has benefits other things do not. There's other ways, other tools that we can use that kind of, that kind of pay attention to other sorts of motivations people have. I mean, I think all of us, as a kind of evaluation thinkers, should be looking at rating systems like Yelp, ratemyprofessor.com, you know, TripAdvisor. Millions of people use these things all the time. There's a motivation there, and we should be paying attention to some of those motivations. And I did a thing called an engagement scorecard, which anyone, if you want to use a version of it, please just email me. But basically, it's a tag-based system, kind of like ratemyprofessor.com, that you can use to evaluate an engagement effort, and also the local democracy, the local kind of state of engagement in your community. So there's different, I mean, we should be paying attention to those sorts of tools and methodologies, partly because people seem to be using them, partly because people then often can take them and apply them to other things. And it kind of helps us understand generally, how can I offer ways of evaluation that are going to be compelling to people, and that's really important. Yeah,
the thinking of different tools is very important.
Sorry, I tied too many threads there into that knot. But now I'll shut up for a while, let other people disentangle them.
Go ahead, Gladys.
Yeah, I really like what Matt was saying about the motivation to participate. And I'm not sure about my fellow panelists here, but I am finding that subjects and key informants of evaluations and assessments are increasingly seeking the report. They want to know what they contributed to, right? They want to know what they contributed to. They want it presented in a way that they can understand, and they want to use it for many things. And so we're increasingly thinking about when you engage upon this process and you determine these are the people we want to hear from, you need to ask yourself why do you want to hear from them, and why would they want to share with you, right? There are other motivating factors, and not only think about how they would participate in the process, but what happens with that product once it's produced and it's out there. Because it's no longer in your sole hands to control how it's disseminated, how it's interpreted, how it's applied. And there's an additional layer of responsibility and accountability at the design phase when you're building it out, because it could land itself in a variety of places and spaces that you don't have control over. And so we're increasingly mindful of that, and also increasingly looking at different ways to help inform our thinking very, very early on, considering not only the audience, but also the informants sometimes over and above our client. I mean, they might want to satisfy a funder, but there are so many different ways to make use of that information to inform planning, to inform design, to inform strategy, product development, you name it. There's a variety of ways that the information could be applied. And so, I really appreciated your point there about the motivation, because I think there are some elements of motivation that we often overlook that are actually quite critical and can really influence what happens with the product after the fact.
Gladys, if I might add, from the US experience, there's certain communities that have been over-evaluated and explored and written about to the point that they refuse to participate anymore, and they've not had control over the data. And that's why they refuse to participate. They don't know what will happen to it and the impact it has on them. And so one of the repercussions of that is that these same neighborhoods are less likely to respond than to questionnaires and surveys on the census. And the census is so important to our local communities because that determines, among other things, the amount of federal tax dollars that are provided to local governments to help provide needed services for citizens. And so if we aren't careful, as you suggest, about what we're asking of people, what control they have over it, what access they will have over it in the future, then you will meet an awful lot of, and I would suggest, deserved resistance. So I think your points are very well taken, and I hope understood the importance by others.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of resistance, we had a couple questions in the chat around the resistance to qualitative methods because they're a bit harder or more expensive, or that perception. And I want to go back to my opening statement around how we tend to privilege certain forms of knowing over others. And so how in government, we often privilege numbers. It's part of our colonial measuring people to manage them history. And so it may take a bit of effort, but it also, perhaps it's not necessarily getting folks to think about how to do qualitative research faster or how to make it easier, but how to emphasize to your stakeholders why it's important. And I'll share an experience from our work. So in the last year, we've done 3 evaluations using many of these question packets. One was with a youth civic education program called City Hive here in Vancouver. Another was with libraries, and a third was with the Vancouver Foundation's Neighborhood Small Grants. We wanted to see if these programs increase democratic commitment and that idea that folks are more active or not. Across the board of these, we found our surveys found no results. And that was valuable because it forced us to ask why. And so we didn't see a change in a pre-post survey in the youth program because we identified in our interviews that the folks who came to the program were already so engaged. There was no way that they could actually answer these questions stronger after the program because they entered so engaged. But what they got out of the program in terms of who was influential to their thinking, who was shaping their next steps, came out of those conversations. Similarly, in the libraries things, you had folks who were engaged in practice. So their numbers didn't really change. It was also the midst of a pandemic. So you have variables you cannot control at all. But the stories that came out, we shifted our focus from does this type of programming work to how can we help this group connect and share what they did, because they wanted that community of practice out of the outcome. And then finally, in our neighborhood small grants, again, the numbers didn't really change in terms of commitments, in terms of how many times they wrote a newspaper, but the stories have become part of our internal organization's learnings, because we started to ask them this simple thing of how did you start? What did you do? What were the outcomes? How did that happen? And themes emerged that the importance of joy in creating change in neighborhoods. So people who were attracted to the program are people who had capacities, they had an idea, but they always paired it with something that was joyful. And there was no way that we would have gotten to that key piece of information out of the thing where we were thinking with the surveys. And it was only by opening this, having a narrative with folks, that we got to that. And now as we design different programs, that's becoming a key piece of how are we getting people to define what brings them joy and bringing that into our democratic programming. So we're doing another program around urban resilient futures, like cities and resilience. The conversation is no longer how many people are going to show up, but okay, which food is going to give these people the most joy? And that's how we're going to transform it. So going back to sort of our other conversations around how you take learnings and shift them into different places, it's about telling those stories and why it's valuable to your stakeholders who are pushing back against those forms of knowing. And so I want to open it up to all of you to share similar stories as we sort of wrap up. And if anyone has any last questions, we are a little bit over the hour, but we do have some flex space here. So if there's any dying questions as folks share other stories, go ahead and pop them in. But spaces for you, Valerie, for you, Erica, Gladys, and Matt, where you've had that kind of surprising outcome that you've then taken into your team and gotten a lot of buy-in.
You know, and particularly as a public servant, almost every interaction with the public is a learning experience. As you transition from the recognition that you aren't doing it for people, but you are doing it with people. That people are adults, They have their own ideas about the places they live and you may visit, but you don't live. They know about the history of the place and what's important historically, who the key people are that ought to be a part of any conversation, and what it is they'd like to see happen. And so just being surprised about the capacity of people to express themselves on what matters to them. And again, we've talked before about the importance of naming. They will use non-bureaucratic words because they don't work in bureaucracies, but how they name and frame something is so important to the solution that is an acceptable one. And it goes back to my earlier comments about ownership. And so one small example is trying to redevelop a neighborhood and proposing an economic development use that, the numbers said this was going to be the highest and best use. We took it out to the community. They were like, this is not at all what we want to see here. We want shopping. We want grocery stores. We want retail. We don't, people don't have cars. They can't get to the malls. And so the reorientation of what was important. And so we reevaluated the work we were doing based on what people wanted and recognized if we asked them first, we would have saved an awful lot of time and energy than waiting until after we had a recommendation and it was all but before the council for city approval. And so the surprise is learning that people do have ideas and we may have disinvited them. They may be frustrated, they may be angry, but they will bring those ideas to the table when it's a topic that they care about.
And when you ask folks a question and they aren't giving you ideas, you're not asking the right question.
Or it's something they don't care about. Organizations and bureaucracies have a tendency to think that what's important to me is important to people in community A. And if they don't show up, it's not important. And it's important because they will show up. And the reason why we have to go out to them is because they probably don't care about it. Because when it's important to them, they're knocking on your door. So the key is to have relationships. I think you continue to talk about the importance of relationships. So and you're hearing what people are talking about, what matters to them, what they see as options and possibilities and solutions. And sometimes it's not possible for you to do. But how close can you get? And how much closer can you get if you're doing something together?
So maybe to wrap up, I'll ask each of you to speak to what about evaluations gives you optimism that it's a tool for building relationships? We've touched, I can see we've touched on this thread a bit, but I want to hear sort of the return to that idea that, as we do evaluations as part of understanding, as part of learning from our participants, as part of evaluating and accountability, how is that building relationships?
Well, if you're asking people up front, why are they interested in working on whatever this is? What are they hoping will come out of it? How would they like to try to measure it? I mean, that conversation is a relationship building and a trust building, conversation, and then can lead to lots of other collaboration down the way. I guess that's the simplest answer I could give.
Yeah. So just to jump in, I know I earlier mentioned that I was one of the people who participated in Apathy is Boring services. And part of my participation, someone actually called me after the event and did an interview with me to talk about and evaluate how that event went. And for me, I've been following Apathy is Boring since I was 12 too. So I've had a deep affinity for Apathy is Boring. But I can imagine if you're someone on the other end of the line where I had spoken to you and had said, hey, I noticed that you're in a lot of our events. I'd really love to hear what you'd have to say in improving table topics, for example. And just when we actually meet the youth that we work with and talk to them and just how excited they are to talk about the services that we have, to talk about, hey, I'm super interested in helping you grow your program and projects. It's been really and this ties back into my love for qualitative methodologies too, is it does build those relationships. It does build that connection with people, and people see you as more than, because I don't get that opportunity usually to work with the young people because I mostly administer the surveys, for example, but when you actually get to see them face to face, that in itself builds that relationship. That in itself also lets them know the organization that I'm really fond of actually cares about my opinions and my thoughts to make their programs and projects better. And that's something that I've personally experienced. It has been so much fun to have experienced initially, but even more fun now that I'm on the other side of things, talking to the young people and doing those focus groups with them and kind of co-creating some of these questions as well has been really, really cool.
Erica, I think you made a really good point about relationships. It's building relationships of trust that allow us to get an awful lot of the work that we do in our respective organizations accomplished. And I would offer that if you evaluate something, a program or a service, and you ask people, as you, Erica, mentioned, and then you see that suggestion or that comment in the work being done going forward, it makes a huge difference. You ask people what they think, and it matters. So often we ask people what they think, but we don't do anything with it. We don't incorporate those ideas into the work going forward. And so people say, well, why did they bother to ask me if they're not going to listen to what I have to say? And so listening and hearing what people have to say, and an evaluation to provide you that opportunity. When you're talking to people, you're building a relationship, you're building ownership, and you're enhancing their capacity to want to be a part of the conversation, want to be a part of the work, and what they can do. And that interaction, they're learning more about what they can do to make a difference as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate all the comments from the panelists. And I guess the one piece that I would add is I'm encouraged by what I see people doing with evaluations, how they're being conducted, and the places in which I'm seeing them applied. Anywhere from very, very large scale planning and development projects to planning, boardrooms, board members assessing, was this a productive meeting? Were we respectful to each other in our interaction? Were we welcoming of new board members? Did we onboard them appropriately? Were we respectful in our engagement? When we held a large, community-based information session, were we mindful of norms and community norms and practices? Like, I see the nature of questioning and the manner in which we're applying evaluations evolving so quickly, and the continuous call for them to be respectful and accountable and transparent in their use. And I think that's great. I think that's really encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all excellent points. I love that Stephen has pointed out, will there be a Yelp-like survey? And it is reminding me that I may not be practicing what I preach in this, and that we do tend to send a survey out of how things went. But I love that, I want to create a space maybe as we close for folks to put in the chat of being like, what did you think? Is there a question we should follow up on? Also, as an evaluation point, is there one thing I should start doing or stop doing the next time I host an online event? So those are all questions for our participants to throw in the chat as we wrap up here. We're being accountable to our audience in that way. Practicing what we preach is always important. It is always nice when someone says we need a part 2. There's always so much more. And so I'll direct you back to the panel. And I'm certain that, if you do have specific questions about programs, feel free to reach out to our different panelists on that. But I think there is an appointment here around evaluations don't just start and stop, but they're an opportunity to keep a conversation going, or to think about what really are you being accountable about as a starting point. I know when I've done very community engaged research, which is not a methodology focused in this evaluation, I would say, but we have designed the workbook as something you could take into a community and sit next to someone and flip through and take that personality test together. So, there's a way you can put that into community-based research, but also in community-based research, they talk about, okay, what is the reciprocity? And how do you activate that reciprocity as quickly as possible? Because it's often, folks don't, glad you said, they want to see the report, but even more, they want to know halfway through how many people did you interview and be part of that experience. And so it's good. It's good. Amelia has a really good question. So if you feel like you're part of an organization, you'd like to share where you're at, go ahead and pop that in the chat. I will leave it sort of with any final thoughts among our panel before we say so long.
Nothing additional for me.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Valerie. Sorry.
No, please, go ahead.
Just that I really appreciate the opportunity to participate. I think we don't have enough of these opportunities to talk about how this work is evolving in a really practical sense, in smaller group settings with practitioners in such a wide variety of areas. So I appreciate you creating the setting to make this happen, Jen. And I think there are some really great, thoughtful comments and questions in the chats. A few I'll certainly take away in the resources that were shared. So yeah, just appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Jen, I don't know if it's possible, but in addition to people putting in their names and locations in the chat, I mean, I don't know if it's possible, but could you send around a list of participants in emails? I don't know if that will require additional permissions from people or something like that, but that would be a cool thing if you can do it.
You know what I'll do is I will change our post-event evaluation survey to include a question where folks can opt in to that. And then we'll pull the resources and the links shared together in the chat, as well as that kind of link to the website. And that will go out to everyone who registered.
Awesome. Thank you. That's terrific. Because this is exactly, I agree. This conversation needs to continue. People need to be able to check in with each other. People doing similar things need to learn about what the other person did in their community. So the more of this that goes on, the better off we'll all be.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
I was going to suggest the learning practices, what's working, what's not working, what we can improve on. We can share that and not have to reinvent the wheel every time.
Absolutely. And then, yeah, so our learning about joy is my new favorite mantra. Like, how are you building joy? Ask people what makes them happy and then figure out how to link your problem solving with that into those spaces. So thank you so much to the four of you for joining us. Thank you so much to all of those who've joined on the chat. Thanks for asking some great questions, Stephen, Amelia, Bessie, and others. I will make sure, we have a tech team who's hearing me say this behind the scenes. Our survey will include an option to include your name, contact information, and organization, so that we could send that back around to everyone. And that would probably be in your inboxes by the end of next week. So thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you for engaging in dialogue, an honest dialogue about this workbook. And I hope that you do download it and flip it through and talk about it with somebody else. So
thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.